The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged cliffs, casting long fiery shadows across the arid canyon. The wind whispered through the desert grass, carrying with it the dry scent of sage and the faint tang of dust. A lone rancher sat near a smoldering fire, his worn hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the last sharp rays of daylight. He was a man carved from solitude, broad-shouldered, tanned, and weathered by years under the unforgiving sun. A quiet strength etched into every line of his face. Life on the range had taught him the art of survival, but it had also taught him the heavier burdens of isolation. The rancher's world had once been full of laughter and companionship, but time and tragedy had stripped it down to this solitary existence, punctuated by the occasional howl of a coyote or the distant clatter of hooves. From the edge of the canyon, movement caught his eye. At first he thought it might be a trick of the wind or the shimmer of heat on stone, but then a figure emerged, walking with a measured grace that betrayed both strength and purpose. She was an Apache woman, her dark hair falling in waves past her shoulders, adorned with a simple braid and a feather tucked behind her ear. Her eyes, deep and dark, held a flicker of something that made the rancher sit up straighter, alert yet unafraid. There was a familiarity in her presence that unsettled him, though he could not place why. She stopped a few paces from his fire, the shadows playing across her features, softening the fierceness in her gaze. "I want a child with you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hiss of the wind. The words were simple, yet they struck him with the force of a thunderclap. His body stiffened. His mind, usually so quick to weigh danger and reason, froze, unable to process the audacity of her declaration. He stared at her, searching for jest, for trickery, but found none. Her eyes did not waver. They were steady, sincere, and filled with a longing that made his chest tighten. He had spent his life defending against intrusions, raiders, wild animals, the ever-encroaching settlers, but nothing had prepared him for this. This was not a test of skill or courage. It was a challenge to the very core of who he was. A man defined by solitude, now confronted with the idea of intimacy, of connection, of legacy. The fire between them crackled, sending sparks into the cooling air as he struggled to find words. Why me?" he finally asked, his voice rough, betraying the confusion and caution that swirled inside him. She stepped closer, the hem of her dress brushing the dry earth, the scent of sage and cedar clinging to her. "Because I see in you something no one else has," she said, her tone gentle but resolute. "Strength, courage, and a heart that can protect what matters most. I have waited for someone like you." Her hand hovered in the air, then fell to rest near his, though she did not touch him fully, a gesture of trust and vulnerability all at once. He looked away for a moment, his gaze drifting to the jagged horizon where the sun was bleeding into the desert sky. A lifetime of walls had trained him to be wary, to keep others at arm's length. Yet something about her presence thawed the edges of his solitude. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a hawk. In that quiet, suspended moment, the rancher felt a stirring of something he had long denied himself. Hope. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps it was destiny, but her words, simple and impossibly daring, had awakened a possibility he had never imagined. A future that included someone else, a life that could be shared, and a legacy that would live beyond the harsh landscape of the present. The woman's gaze held his, unwavering, patient. "Do you understand?" she asked, and in that one question lay a lifetime of expectation, courage, and hope. He nodded slowly, not because he had answers, but because he understood the weight of the choice before him. This was no mere whisper. It was a declaration, a spark in the gathering darkness, and the first step into a future neither of them could yet fully see. The firelight danced across the rancher's face, but his thoughts had already wandered far from the canyon floor. Memories, sharp and unyielding, clawed their way to the surface. He had not always been a lone figure against the endless horizon. Once his life had been filled with the warmth of a family, laughter echoing across the wooden floors of a small homestead, the smell of bread baking in the oven, and the steady hum of contentment. That life had been stolen from him by disease and misfortune, leaving only the solitude that now defined his days. He had learned to survive, yes, but at a cost. He had become a man wary of attachment, a man whose heart had built walls as high and jagged as the cliffs surrounding him. And yet, the Apache woman before him seemed to see beyond those walls, as though she had glimpsed the lonely, tender heart hidden inside the rugged exterior. Her courage intrigued him, yes, but it was more than that. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had faced loss and hardship of her own. He could sense it in the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful way her eyes scanned the landscape even in his presence. She had survived storms of her own, and that survival demanded respect. She too bore scars invisible to the casual observer. As she approached the fire, her thoughts drifted to the losses she had endured. Her family had been torn apart by raids and the relentless march of settlers into their lands. She had learned early how to navigate a world that was often cruel and unforgiving, how to protect herself and those she loved, and how to endure when hope seemed a distant memory. That same endurance had brought her to him, to this isolated canyon where she sensed something rare, someone who could both protect and cherish what she hoped to bring into the world. The rancher studied her quietly. She was unlike anyone he had met, strong yet gentle, fearless yet vulnerable. He saw in her a reflection of his own solitude, but also a spark of something he had long forgotten, the possibility of connection. Her whispered words from the previous evening echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. "I want a child with you." Simple words, yet so heavy with promise and risk that they had unsettled him, awakened something long dormant. "What makes you think I could give you what you want?" he asked finally, his voice rough but not unkind. It was a question half of curiosity, half of disbelief. His life had been shaped by survival and labor, not by love and family. He feared failing, feared bringing a child into a harsh, unpredictable world, feared the vulnerability such a bond demanded. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across his knees. "Because you have survived when others would have fallen. Because you see the value of life even in its harshest moments. And because I believe that together, we can create something that will endure long after we are gone." Her voice was calm, steady and unwavering, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine that endurance, that hope, as a possibility rather than a dream. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush, and the fire's crackle became a quiet companion to their thoughts. In the distance, the cliffs glowed faintly orange as the last light of day bled over the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them, linking their fates in ways neither could yet understand. He remained silent, wrestling with the strange cocktail of fear, longing and awe that her presence inspired. To open himself to her was to risk everything he had worked so hard to guard, his independence, his safety, his heart. And yet there was a pull, undeniable and magnetic, that made him lean closer, if only slightly, toward the possibility she offered. She, sensing his hesitation, did not push. Instead, she sat quietly across from him, the firelight illuminating the quiet determination in her eyes. She understood that trust could not be forced, only nurtured, and she would wait, because some things, like the creation of a life, like the forging of a bond, were worth patience, worth courage, worth the leap into uncertainty. The canyon around them seemed to hold its breath, the vast silence stretching between firelight and shadow. In that quiet, fragile moment, both of them recognized the truth they could not yet speak aloud. This was the beginning of a journey neither had anticipated, a crossing of paths that could change everything, for better or worse. The next morning, the canyon awoke to the soft golden light of dawn, and with it came a quiet sense of tension. The rancher and the Apache woman moved carefully among the dry brush, preparing for a day that promised work and ritual alike. Each step she took seemed measured, graceful yet purposeful, as though every movement carried with it the weight of her intentions and the promise she had whispered the night before. They had not spoken of her wish again since that first evening. Words, fragile and heavy with meaning, hung unspoken between them like smoke above the fire. Both understood that acknowledgement was only the beginning. Trust and understanding would need time to grow, nurtured by patience and shared experiences. The rancher, though wary of attachment, found himself noticing details he had once ignored. The way her fingers moved with precision when she gathered firewood, the quiet confidence in her stance, and the soft but steady rhythm of her breathing when she paused to listen to the canyon's sounds. Their growing closeness, however, did not go unnoticed. Tribal elders from nearby Apache bands patrolling the edges of the land observed the pair with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The woman's decision to speak so boldly of creating a child with a man outside traditional norms raised questions that could carry consequences if ignored. Whispered warnings followed them through the wind-carved cliffs, and though the elders had not yet confronted them directly, the tension was palpable. Despite the caution imposed by culture and circumstance, the rancher and the woman found themselves drawn together by subtle, unspoken gestures. He offered her water from his canteen without hesitation. She responded with a quiet nod and a smile that seemed to warm even the crisp morning air. Together they repaired a small fence near his homestead, shared the labor of tending a modest herd, and navigated the dangers of the terrain with a cautious synchronicity born of mutual respect. Every shared task, every small success became a building block and a fragile bridge between their lives. As they worked, the woman spoke little of her past, but the rancher began to glean fragments. She had survived raids that had left entire families broken, navigated territories claimed by settlers with vigilance and cunning, and preserved a lineage and heritage that might otherwise have vanished. In her eyes he saw both the weight of survival and a spark of hope, a spark that, against all odds, reached toward him. At midday, they rested beneath a scraggly mesquite, the heat of the sun pressing against their shoulders. She glanced at him, hesitated, and finally asked, "Do you think a child could grow up in a world like this?" Her voice was quiet, almost afraid of the answer but filled with longing. The rancher considered the question carefully. He could see the harshness of the world reflected in the jagged cliffs, in the unyielding desert, in the unpredictable arrival of settlers and rival tribes. But in her presence he also glimpsed possibility, resilience, courage, and the unspoken promise of companionship. "Perhaps," he said finally, "if we teach them strength and show them love, yes, perhaps they could." The woman's eyes softened, and for the first time she allowed herself to lean slightly closer, their shoulders brushing. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, an acknowledgement that their fates, tentative as they were beginning to entwine. Even as the day passed in quiet labor and shared silences, the tension of the outside world lingered. Other families, other warriors, other traditions, each represented a subtle pressure, a reminder that love and desire existed within boundaries and rules. They would need courage not just to survive the wilderness, but to survive the judgments of others who might not understand the bond forming here. As evening approached, the canyon once again filled with shadows and the fire was rekindled. They sat near it, closer now than before, sharing the warmth of flames and the quiet rhythm of the desert night. Neither spoke of what lay ahead, but in the flickering light and the soft crackle of embers there was understanding. A trust was forming, fragile yet undeniable, a bridge built not only from desire but from recognition of each other's strength and endurance. The whisper from the first night, once shocking and audacious, now felt like a thread tying them together, fragile but unbroken. And though challenges still loomed, expectations, threats, and the uncertainty of the future, they had taken the first steps towards something that might survive, something that might endure beyond the harshness of the canyon, and even beyond themselves. The quiet of the canyon did not last. As the days passed, signs of intrusion began to appear, trampled brush, distant hoofbeats, and smoke curling faintly on the horizon. Settlers and rival bands of raiders were moving closer, their presence a harsh reminder that the desert was never truly empty, and that survival was never guaranteed. The rancher, accustomed to the solitude of his land, tensed as he scanned the ridges with sharp, trained eyes. The Apache woman moved beside him, alert, her hand brushing the hilt of a small knife at her waist, a silent signal that she was ready for whatever might come. The intrusion brought a new urgency to her whispered desire for a child. In her mind, every threat, every shadow across the canyon was a reminder of life's fragility. She wanted more than love. She wanted continuity, a living legacy that could endure in a world where so much could be lost in an instant. The rancher sensed this urgency, though it was tempered by his own fears. He had spent years protecting himself alone, and now the idea of defending another life, especially a child, stirred something both protective and hesitant within him. One afternoon, as they scouted the edge of a nearby creek, a distant commotion broke the stillness. Smoke rose from a settler's outpost, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the canyon walls. The rancher's body went taut, instincts honed by years of hardship taking over. Without a word, he pulled the Apache woman down into the shadow of a rock outcropping. Her dark eyes met his, filled not with fear but determination. They were no longer simply two individuals navigating solitude. They were partners facing danger together. The attack was brief, but intense. Raiders had struck at a supply camp, leaving destruction in their wake. Though they were far enough to avoid direct harm, the proximity was a warning. The canyon and its surrounding lands were no longer safe. The rancher realized that any child they might bring into this world would need protection, and the weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. He looked at her, and in that glance they both understood the stakes. Survival was no longer just about themselves. It was about the possibility of life and hope beyond the present moment. That night, as they rebuilt a small shelter near the creek and tended to minor injuries from the day's skirmish, conversation turned to the future. The woman spoke softly, her voice carrying the faint tremor of both fear and resolve. "I cannot ignore what I feel. The world is dangerous, yes, but we cannot let fear stop us from creating life. I want a child with you because I believe in hope, even when hope seems foolish." The rancher, his hands steady as he worked on mending torn cloth, paused to look at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, not the blaze of anger or defiance, but the quiet, enduring flame of someone who had endured loss and still dared to dream. He realized that protecting a child, building a family, was not merely a risk, it was a chance to reclaim something they had both been denied. A legacy, a connection, a life worth fighting for. He nodded slowly, the decision forming in the quiet of the night. "Then we will face it together," he said, the words heavy with promise. "I will protect you, and if a child comes, I will protect them too. I do not know what the future holds, but I know this. We face it together." In that moment, the desert seemed less empty. The fire crackled, shadows dancing over the rocks as if acknowledging the bond that had been solidifying between them. Despite the encroaching threats, despite the uncertainty of the world beyond the canyon, there was a fragile certainty in their connection, a recognition that they were no longer alone, that hope and survival could coexist. As dawn approached and the first light touched the horizon, they settled near the fire, exhausted but resolute. Each of them carried the knowledge of the dangers ahead, yet neither wavered in their silent commitment. The whisper from the first night had grown into something more than a desire. It had become a shared purpose, a foundation that might endure even in a world that seemed determined to take everything away. And in that quiet, tense, fragile night, the possibility of life, a child, a future, a legacy was no longer a whisper. It was a spark ready to ignite if only they dared to protect it together. The sun had barely risen when the rancher and the Apache woman mounted their horses, the quiet tension of the canyon clinging to them like a second skin. Word had reached them of a band of raiders moving through the northern passes, threatening both the few scattered settlers and Apache families in the area. The danger was clear, unavoidable, and it demanded action. It was no longer a choice. They had to act, and they had to act together. The ride was tense, each movement deliberate. Dust rose from their horses' hooves, swirling in the morning light like tiny storms of warning. The rancher's eyes constantly scanned the ridges, his hand hovering near the rifle strapped across his back. Beside him, the woman rode with a calm vigilance, every muscle taut, ready to react at a moment's notice. This mission was not merely about survival. It was about proving to each other, and to themselves, that trust could exist even in the harshest of circumstances. They reached a narrow canyon pass where the raiders were last seen. From a distance, the rancher could make out movement. A small camp hidden among rocks and sagebrush, smoke curling lazily into the sky. He turned to her, reading the determination on her face. "We can't rush in," he murmured. "We need to know what we're up against." She nodded, her hand brushing briefly against his, a small gesture of reassurance. "We watch, we wait. Then we act together," she said, her voice low but firm. In that simple phrase, he felt the bond between them solidify. No longer were they individuals acting alone. They were a unit, each reliant on the other's judgment, courage, and skill. Hours passed as they crouched behind rocks, observing the raiders' movements. The woman pointed out weak spots in their defenses, her knowledge of terrain and strategy guiding their planning. The rancher, impressed by her insight, realized that her strength was not just physical but intellectual, and that relying on her did not make him weaker, it made them stronger. When the moment came to strike, it was swift and precise. They ambushed the raiders at a narrow choke point, using the element of surprise to their advantage. The clash was brief but intense. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon walls, and dust and grit filled the air. Through it all, they moved seamlessly together, covering each other's backs, communicating in silence and gestures honed by mutual trust. After the last raider had fled or surrendered, the rancher and the woman took a moment to catch their breath. He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw a mixture of exhilaration and relief, the same emotions he felt but had rarely admitted to himself. "We make a good team," he said, a hint of a smile breaking through his normally stoic demeanor. She returned the smile, though her expression quickly softened. "We make a family," she said quietly, almost to herself. The words struck him, reminding him of the whispered desire she had spoken weeks ago, the desire for a child, for continuity, for hope. He realized that survival alone was not enough. It was this connection, this shared purpose that gave life meaning. That night, as they camped near the creek once more, the fire between them seemed warmer, more intimate. They shared stories of past hardships, laughter mingling with the crackle of embers. For the first time in years, the rancher allowed himself to imagine a life beyond solitude, a life where trust, companionship, and love could coexist with the dangers of the world. The woman, sensing his thoughts, reached out and placed her hand over his. "Whatever comes," she said, her voice steady, "we face it together, and if a child comes into our world, they will grow up knowing strength, courage, and love." The rancher nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a mantle he was finally ready to carry. He had survived alone for so long, but now he understood that strength was not measured only by endurance or skill. It was measured by the willingness to protect, to trust, and to love. As the night deepened and the canyon fell into quiet, they sat together, the firelight casting long shadows across the rocky walls. Each knew that danger still lay ahead, but they had proven to themselves and to each other that together, they could face whatever the world might throw at them. In that shared triumph, a bond was cemented, fragile yet unbreakable, a promise that life, love, and hope could flourish even amid hardship. The fire crackled softly, sending flickers of light across the rocks and casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. Night had settled over the canyon, cool and still, and for the first time in days, the rancher allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. The adrenaline of the skirmish with the raiders had faded, leaving in its place a quiet awareness of the woman beside him. She was tending the fire with calm precision, her eyes reflecting the flames, and something in that ordinary moment struck him more profoundly than any danger ever could. She glanced up at him, her dark eyes steady. "You fought well today," she said softly, her voice carrying both admiration and warmth. There was no flattery in it, no embellishment, just truth. And in that truth, he felt a spark of connection he had long denied himself. He had lived among people before, known friendship, even love, but those days seemed like echoes from another life. Now here in the desert with this woman who had dared to speak of a child with him, he felt the stirrings of something new. Trust, companionship, and the possibility of love that was grounded not in comfort, but in respect and shared courage. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted, finally allowing the words to leave his lips. "I've faced danger before many times, but it's different when someone you care for is at your side. Someone you trust." His voice trailed off, almost catching on the vulnerability he felt. The woman's lips curved slightly, and she shifted closer to the fire, the warmth brushing against his side. "I trust you," she said simply. "I have never met anyone who makes me feel safe even when the world is falling apart. You give me hope even in the darkest moments." Her hand hovered near his as if waiting for permission, and when he did not pull away, she let it rest lightly on his. The touch was electric in its simplicity, conveying far more than words ever could. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a coyote. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember what I said the first night?" The rancher nodded, feeling a knot of emotion tighten in his chest. The memory of her words, "I want a child with you," had haunted him, unsettled him, and now, in the quiet of the night, he understood the depth behind them. "Do you still want that?" he asked cautiously, his voice rough with uncertainty. There was a vulnerability in him he rarely allowed to surface, a fear that speaking it aloud might shatter the fragile trust forming between them. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I want a child. Not just for myself, but for the life we could build together, for the future, for hope. I have survived much and I do not fear more. I only fear that someday, someone might take what we have, what I hope to create, away from us." Her words struck him like an arrow, straight to the heart. He realized that her desire was not born from whimsy or fleeting passion. It was rooted in resilience, in hope, in a vision of a life worth living, despite all the hardships they faced. And he understood that to embrace her wish was to embrace a life beyond himself, a life that demanded courage, vulnerability, and trust. "I want it too," he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can give you everything you hope for, but I want to try. I want to face the world with you, and if a child comes, I will protect them with everything I have. I will protect you both." A gentle smile touched her lips, her eyes shining with relief and affection. For the first time, the tension of unspoken words lifted, replaced by a fragile but undeniable bond. The firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting the newfound connection between them. Two souls, scarred by past losses, daring to hope for love, family, and a future together. As the night deepened, they leaned closer, sharing warmth and quiet laughter, the canyon holding its breath around them. Outside threat still loomed, and the desert was unforgiving, but for the first time they felt ready to face it together. Hope, like the flickering fire, burned steadily between them, a promise that even in the harshest of landscapes, life, love, and trust could flourish. Dawn broke over the canyon, painting the rocky cliffs with streaks of gold and rose. The desert was quiet, save for the distant calls of birds and the occasional whisper of wind through the scrub. The rancher and the Apache woman stood atop a narrow ridge overlooking the valley below. The events of the past days, the raids, the dangers, the shared battles had drawn them closer than either could have imagined. Yet now they faced a different kind of challenge, the commitment to each other and the life they were beginning to imagine together. The woman reached into a small pouch she had carried, pulling out a few strands of braided hair and a piece of leather cord. "This is how my grandmother sealed promises," she explained softly, her eyes fixed on the valley below. "We bind it with intention, a symbol of trust, hope, and protection." She handed him the leather cord. The rancher's hands were rough, calloused from years of labor, but he accepted it reverently, recognizing the significance behind the gesture. They knelt together, weaving their own strands of hair into the cord, their fingers brushing occasionally. The act was simple, yet it carried immense weight, a tangible representation of the bond forming between them. As they worked, they spoke quietly, confessing hopes and fears. She admitted her longing for a child, for a life that could survive beyond the harshness of their world. He spoke of the solitude he had endured, the losses he had suffered, and the fear that he might fail to protect the fragile life they hoped to create. When the braid was complete, she held it out to him. "This is a promise," she said. "No matter what comes, we protect each other. We face danger together, and if a child comes, we honor them with courage and love." He nodded, taking the cord and fastening it around his wrist. "I promise," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "I will protect you. I will protect our future. Whatever comes, we face it together." The act of sealing this promise brought an unexpected peace to them both. The rancher, who had spent so long guarding his heart, felt a weight lift. The woman, who had long carried the burdens of survival alone, felt the warmth of shared hope. In that quiet moment high above the canyon, they understood that their bond was no longer tentative. It was sacred, built on trust, respect, and mutual courage. The canyon below stretched endlessly, a world of danger and beauty intertwined. They could see the paths they had traveled, the valleys where they had faced uncertainty, and the ridge ahead where possibilities awaited, though threats still lingered. Raiders, settlers, the unforgiving desert, they now had a shared anchor, a reason to endure beyond the instinct for survival. As the sun climbed higher, they rode back down toward their camp, the cord wrapped around the rancher's wrist, a constant reminder of their vow. Along the way, they spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, filled with understanding and quiet assurance. Every glance, every brush of their hands reinforced the unspoken truth. They were no longer two solitary figures navigating the harshness of life alone. They were a unit, bound not just by desire or necessity but by choice and commitment. That evening, as the fire flickered and the desert cooled, they returned to their routines, but with a subtle shift. Their movements were more synchronized, their trust more instinctive. The bond they had symbolically sealed had become tangible in the way they moved through the world together, and when the woman finally spoke of the possibility of a child again, the rancher no longer hesitated. Instead, he embraced the vision, knowing that the life they hoped to bring into the world would be nurtured by a foundation stronger than fear or circumstance. Under the stars, the canyon seemed to acknowledge their vow, the quiet night holding them in its embrace. Two lives once isolated and wary had now intertwined, and the promise of the future of love, family, and endurance burned steadily between them, unshakable and true. The desert air was tense, carrying the scent of dust, sagebrush, and distant smoke. The past few days had been uneventful, a deceptive calm that had lulled the rancher and the Apache woman into a sense of routine. But deep in the canyons, threats were gathering. Raiders had returned, more numerous and organized than before, and rumors of settlers encroaching further into Apache territory spread like wildfire. The peace they had carved for themselves was fragile, and the couple could feel it shattering with every whispered wind. They were riding along a narrow ridge when they first spotted them, a small band of mounted raiders moving through the valley below. Their intent was clear: plunder, intimidation, and chaos. The rancher felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, but it was different this time. This time he was not fighting only for his own survival. The woman at his side and the child they hoped for were part of the stakes. Every instinct screamed caution, every muscle tensed in readiness. The woman scanned the terrain, her eyes sharp. "We can't face them head-on," she said, "but we can use the canyon. We can create a trap, make them think twice before reaching the settlements." Her confidence was unwavering, her strategy precise. The rancher admired her courage, and he felt the bond between them tighten. Their survival depended on trust, and they had both learned to rely on each other implicitly. The plan was set. They moved quickly, using the narrow passes and rocky outcroppings to their advantage. With careful coordination, they positioned fallen logs and loose boulders, creating barriers that would slow the raiders and give them the upper hand. Every movement was synchronized, every glance a silent communication. They were no longer two people navigating danger separately. They were a unit, a single force forged by shared purpose and growing affection. When the raiders finally entered the pass, chaos erupted. Rocks tumbled, horses reared, and the narrow canyon amplified every shout and cry. The rancher and the woman fought side by side, their movements fluid, protective, instinctive. The woman's agility and knowledge of the land allowed her to anticipate the raiders' moves, while the rancher's strength and skill ensured they could counter any attack. The canyon became a battleground, but also a testament to their trust and resilience. Amid the fight, a raider broke through their defenses, heading straight for the woman. Time seemed to slow as the rancher reacted, stepping between her and danger, his rifle raised, heart pounding. The shot rang out and the threat was neutralized, but in that heartbeat, the rancher realized the truth he could no longer ignore. He would risk everything for her. For their future, for the child they dreamed of bringing into this harsh world. When the skirmish ended, the raiders either fled or surrendered, leaving the couple exhausted, covered in dust and sweat. But alive, they collapsed near their camp, the firelight casting long shadows across their faces. Words were unnecessary. The adrenaline had spoken for them, yet in the quiet that followed, the rancher finally reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We survived," he said, his voice heavy with relief. "And we will face whatever comes next, together." The woman smiled, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and pride. "We have to be careful," she said. "The world outside may never be safe, but we can create safety here for us and for the child we hope for." The weight of her words settled over them, a reminder of the stakes beyond mere survival. Every choice, every battle, every risk they took was part of a larger mission: the preservation of life, love, and hope in a world that often sought to destroy it. As night fell, they sat close to the fire, sharing warmth, silence, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the dangers they faced had forged something stronger than fear or desire. It had created trust, commitment, and the foundation for a future worth protecting. The canyon, wide and indifferent, seemed to hold them in a fragile embrace, as if acknowledging that for now, they had carved out a sanctuary of resilience, courage, and love. The whisper of her wish from the first night had grown into a shared purpose. The desert might be harsh, the world might be unforgiving, but together they had become unstoppable. And nothing, not even danger, could undo the promise they had made. The canyon was quiet, almost reverent, as the rancher and the Apache woman moved through the early morning mist. The days of constant danger had given way to a fragile calm, a time for reflection and preparation, and now, the future they had whispered about so many nights ago had begun to take shape in a way neither had fully dared to imagine. She was with child. The revelation had come gently, almost unexpectedly. At first, the rancher had noticed subtle changes, the slight weariness in her movements, the way she cradled her stomach without consciously realizing it. When she had finally confirmed it, there had been no dramatic exclamations, no grand proclamations. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a soft smile, and a shared glance that spoke volumes. This child, the living embodiment of their trust and hope, was both a miracle and a responsibility that neither could ignore. For the woman, the pregnancy was a symbol of hope, a promise that life could endure even in a world that often sought to take everything away. She walked with a new awareness, feeling the life growing within her, imagining the child she would teach to survive, to respect the land, and to understand courage and resilience. Each day she moved with purpose, tending to the small garden they had cultivated, gathering water, and preparing their modest camp with a care that spoke not only of survival, but of nurturing. The rancher watched her with a mixture of awe and tenderness. He had faced storms, raids, and countless dangers, yet none had stirred him like this quiet transformation. Every decision now carried weight beyond his own survival. Every action, every risk was measured against the promise of this new life. He found himself thinking differently, planning differently, hoping differently. He was no longer just a man protecting himself. He was a man protecting the future. As the days passed, their bond deepened. They spoke openly of their hopes and fears, their whispered confessions no longer confined to private moments but integrated into the rhythm of their daily lives. The rancher admitted his lingering doubts, fear of failing, fear of being unable to provide the protection and stability this child would need, but she met him with calm assurance. "We will face it together," she said, echoing the words they had spoken after their first skirmish. And in those words he found strength, courage, and clarity. One evening, as the sun sank behind the canyon walls, casting long shadows across the desert floor, they sat together near the fire. She rested her hand on her rounded belly, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I wonder what they will be like," she whispered. "Brave? Curious, kind?" He smiled, placing his rough hand over hers. "They will have your courage and my stubbornness," he said with a hint of humor, and she laughed softly, the sound a balm to the tension that had always hovered at the edges of their lives. "And together," he added seriously, "we will teach them to survive, to respect the land, and to know love." The thought of the child brought a sense of purpose that neither had anticipated. The desert, once a harsh and unforgiving place, now held promise. Every sunrise was a reminder that life continued, every night a testament to endurance and hope. The child growing within her was not just a continuation of their bloodlines, it was a living symbol of trust, courage, and the possibility of happiness amidst hardship. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, the couple sat close, the woman leaning against the rancher's shoulder. Outside threats still lingered, the world remained dangerous, but in that quiet night, they allowed themselves a rare moment of peace. The child they carried was a reminder that even in a harsh world, life could endure, hope could flourish, and love could create something stronger than fear. And for the first time in years, they dared to believe not only in survival, but in a future where family, trust, and love would guide them through whatever storms lay ahead. The desert dawn was soft, the sky painted in delicate hues of pink and gold, as if the world itself had paused to honor the moment. The rancher was awake long before the sun fully rose, his eyes scanning the canyon with a vigilance honed by years of solitude and survival. But today his focus was different. Today his purpose had taken on a new depth, fueled by the life growing inside the woman beside him. She stirred in the camp, her movements slower, careful as her body prepared to bring their child into the world. The rancher knelt beside her, his hands steady despite the tremor of excitement and worry in his chest. "It's time," she whispered, her voice a mixture of pain and anticipation, and he nodded, his heart pounding. Every trial they had faced together, the raids, the harsh terrain, the constant threat of outsiders had led to this moment. The birth was arduous, each wave of pain mirrored by the rancher's clenched fists and focused gaze. He held her hand, whispered encouragements, and tended to her with a care that transcended words. In the flickering firelight, amidst the rugged beauty of the canyon, a new chapter began, one defined not by survival alone but by life, love, and hope. Hours passed like minutes, and finally, a cry cut through the quiet desert air, a newborn's first breath. The rancher and the woman exchanged a look of profound wonder and relief. Their child, a living testament to the trust, courage, and love that had bound them together, had arrived into the world. The rancher's rough hands cradled the tiny life, and in that moment, he understood the full magnitude of what had been whispered that first night. "I want a child with you." The words were no longer a fragile hope. They were reality. The woman, exhausted but radiant, smiled at him, her eyes shining with tears. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with awe. "Our family. It exists." He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "We did it," he echoed. "And I promise, I will protect you both always." The canyon seemed to hold its breath around them, the wind whispering through the cliffs as if acknowledging the significance of the moment. For the first time in years, the rancher felt complete, not just alive but whole, tethered to something far greater than himself. As the morning sun climbed higher, they tended to their newborn, their movements careful and reverent. Every smile, every coo, every small grasp of tiny fingers reminded them of the bond that had brought them here. It was a life born from hope, trust, and love, forged through trials that had tested their courage and endurance. And it was a promise kept, a promise that the whisper of desire, spoken in a quiet desert canyon, had become tangible and eternal. The days that followed were filled with learning, laughter, and quiet moments of awe. The rancher taught the child the ways of the land, showing gentle hands how to respect the earth and move with awareness. The woman shared stories of her ancestors, passing on traditions, courage, and resilience. Together, they created a life shaped by their shared experiences, love, and determination to nurture this new life in a harsh and unforgiving world. At night, when the fire burned low and the stars stretched across the sky, they would sit together, the child nestled between them. The rancher would brush a hand over the woman's hair, and she would rest her head on his shoulder, the quiet strength of their bond reflected in every shared breath. They had survived alone, fought together, and now they thrived together, building a legacy that would outlast both danger and solitude. The canyon, vast and eternal, bore witness to their journey, from whispered desires to fulfilled dreams. And in that rugged, beautiful landscape, life continued, a new generation born of courage, hope, and love, a promise kept, and a future forged by the strength of two hearts willing to trust, endure, and embrace the unknown. The whisper that had begun it all, "I want a child with you," was no longer a fragile plea. It had become a living reality, a family, a legacy, and a testament to the power of trust, courage, and enduring love in a world that had tested them at every turn.